Richard Calloway stared at the bankruptcy papers that would end his 30-year empire. His lawyers insisted it was his only option, that the documents were perfect, that he needed to sign now before creditors destroyed everything. But as a black waitress named Maya Jefferson refilled his coffee, her eyes caught something on page 14 that didn't add up. And when she quietly set down a napkin with 5 words written on it, she was about to prove that sometimes the most important voice in a room is the one nobody expects to hear. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The silence in the Sterling Reserve's private executive dining room felt thick enough to suffocate. Outside the tall windows, Manhattan glittered with afternoon sunlight, but inside, shadows stretched across mahogany furniture that cost more than most people earned in a year. The air conditioning hummed quietly, fighting against the tension that made the room feel smaller than it actually was. Richard Calloway sat at the head of the table, his hands folded in front of him, staring at the stack of documents that represented the complete destruction of everything he'd built over 30 years. His gray suit, custom-tailored from a London shop he'd visited twice a year, hung looser than it had 6 months ago. The weight loss wasn't intentional. Stress had a way of reshaping a man from the inside out. The papers were organized with military precision. Each section tabbed, each page numbered, each signature line marked with a small red arrow pointing exactly where his pen should land. It looked professional. It looked inevitable. It looked like the only way forward. Richard picked up the first page, scanning words that blurred together. Liquidation, asset forfeiture, creditor satisfaction, Chapter 11 restructuring. The language of failure dressed up in legal terminology that made it sound almost respectable. He'd signed thousands of contracts in his career, built an empire on knowing exactly what every clause meant, every loophole, every advantage. Now he sat here, barely able to focus on a single paragraph. Mr. Calloway, we really need to move forward with this. The voice came from his left. Marcus Webb, senior partner at Webb & Associates, the firm that had represented Richard's interests for 15 years. Marcus wore his authority like a second skin. Perfectly pressed charcoal suit, gold cufflinks catching the light every time he gestured. Every hour we delay costs you leverage with the creditors. Richard didn't look up. I'm reading. You've been reading for 20 minutes. This voice belonged to Patricia Vance, Marcus's associate, younger, sharper around the edges, less patience in her tone. The terms are straightforward. We've explained them 3 times. Then a 4th won't hurt. Richard finally lifted his eyes, meeting Patricia's gaze. She looked away first, glancing at Marcus with barely concealed irritation. There were 4 lawyers in total, spread around the table like chess pieces guarding their king. Except Richard wasn't sure anymore if he was the king or just another pawn being moved toward an inevitable outcome. Besides Marcus and Patricia, there was James Hartford for the bankruptcy division, a quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses who'd barely spoken since arriving, and Catherine Morris, who specialized in corporate dissolution. Her red hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. Mr. Calloway. Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on that careful tone people used when they were trying to sound sympathetic, but were actually just impatient. I understand this is difficult. 30 years of work, your father's legacy, the company bearing your family name. But we're past the point of sentiment. Your accounts are frozen. 3 separate lawsuits are pending. Your partners have already distanced themselves. Bankruptcy protection is the only shield you have left. Richard felt the words land like physical blows. Partners who'd sent Christmas cards to his children for a decade had stopped returning calls the moment the first lawsuit hit the news. Bank accounts he'd accessed freely for years were suddenly unavailable, tied up in legal freezes he didn't fully understand. His personal attorney, a man he'd golfed with every Sunday for 8 years, had recommended Marcus's firm and then quietly withdrawn from representation entirely. Everything had collapsed so fast. 6 months ago, he'd been fielding acquisition offers, turning down speaking engagements, planning expansion into European markets. Now he sat in a private dining room at a club where he'd once entertained senators, signing away everything to satisfy debts he hadn't even known existed until they appeared in legal filings that arrived like grenades through his office door. The door to the kitchen opened quietly. Richard barely registered the movement, but Patricia's eyes flicked toward the interruption with visible annoyance. A woman entered carrying a silver tray with water glasses and a fresh carafe of coffee. She wore the Sterling Reserve's standard service uniform, black slacks, and a white button-down shirt with the club's emblem on the pocket. Her movements were efficient, practiced, the kind of invisibility that expensive establishments trained their staff to perfect. She was black, probably late 20s, with her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She set the water glasses down without a sound, her eyes downcast in that professional way service workers learn to adopt. Don't interrupt. Don't intrude. Don't be noticed unless absolutely necessary. Thank you, Richard said quietly. She nodded once, no words, and stepped back toward the wall where a small service table held extra napkins and condiments. Patricia didn't bother acknowledging her at all. The timeline is critical, Mr. Calloway. If you don't file by end of business today, the creditor's agreement expires. They'll pursue individual collection actions, which means lawsuits, asset seizures, potentially criminal investigations into financial irregularities. Criminal? Richard's head snapped up. There are no irregularities. There are always irregularities when companies collapse this quickly. James Hartford spoke for the first time, his voice dry and factual. Investigations look for someone to blame. Right now, you can control the narrative through structured bankruptcy. Tomorrow, you might not have that option. The waitress moved around the table, refilling Marcus's coffee cup. Her presence was so unobtrusive that the lawyers continued talking as if she didn't exist. But Richard noticed her eyes, just for a moment, glancing at the documents spread across the table. It was quick, barely perceptible, but he caught it. She was reading. Not just glancing, but actually reading the dense legal text printed on the papers nearest to Marcus's elbow. Mr. Calloway, Catherine Morris spoke up, her tone precise and measured. Let me be absolutely clear about what we're protecting you from. Your personal assets, your home, your wife's trust fund, your children's education accounts. All of that can be shielded under this filing. Wait, and they become fair game for creditors who will not show mercy. Richard felt his chest tighten. His wife, Jennifer, had already moved to their Connecticut property with their 2 children, unable to bear the media attention, the whispers at their daughter's private school, the way their social circle had evaporated overnight. His son's college tuition was paid through next semester, but after that, nothing was guaranteed. How did this happen? Richard heard himself ask, voice barely above a whisper. How did 30 years disappear in 6 months? The lawyers exchanged glances. It was Patricia who answered, her tone suggesting she'd explained this before and was tired of repeating it. The market downturn hit your leverage positions. Your partners withdrew capital. The lawsuits triggered acceleration clauses in your debt agreements. It's a perfect storm, Mr. Calloway. No one is at fault. It's simply unfortunate timing. But that didn't make sense. Richard had weathered market downturns before. He'd survived the 2008 crisis, had restructured during the dot-com bust, had navigated regulatory changes that destroyed competitors. He wasn't reckless. He didn't over-leverage. He built slowly, carefully, with redundancies and safeguards. The waitress was at his elbow now, setting down a fresh water glass. As she placed it on the coaster, her hand brushed against one of the document pages, shifting it slightly. Richard glanced down and saw what she'd moved, a page labeled Asset Reclassification Summary, in bold text at the top. He'd skimmed it earlier, something about reorganizing holdings into different corporate structures for creditor distribution. But as the waitress stepped back, Richard noticed something odd. The page listed his European subsidiary, Calloway International Holdings, as liquidated, zero value. That couldn't be right. That division had been profitable last quarter. He'd received a report just weeks ago about a new contract they'd secured with a German manufacturing firm. Excuse me, Richard pointed at the page. This line here about the European holdings, already addressed. Marcus interrupted smoothly. That subsidiary was technically solvent, but operationally tied to your primary corporate structure. In bankruptcy, It needs to be classified as part of the estate. It's standard procedure. But it says liquidated. Liquidated for purposes of the filing, Patricia added quickly. It's terminology, Mr. Calloway. Don't get caught up in semantics. We need signatures, not a vocabulary lesson. The waitress had returned to her position by the wall. Richard glanced at her and saw something flicker across her face. A tiny furrow between her eyebrows, a slight tightening of her jaw. She'd heard that exchange, and unless he was reading her completely wrong, she didn't agree with Patricia's explanation. Gentlemen, ladies, Marcus stood up, buttoning his suit jacket in a gesture that suggested finality. It's 3:30. We have until 5 to file these documents with the court. That gives us 90 minutes to review, sign, and deliver. I strongly suggest we use that time wisely. Richard felt the pressure like a physical weight on his shoulders. They were right about the timeline. He'd verified it himself with an independent attorney who'd at least returned one phone call before also going silent. The creditor's agreement expired at 5. After that, chaos, individual lawsuits, asset freezes, public spectacle. His face on the news, another fallen billionaire for people to mock over dinner. He'd become exactly the kind of person he used to read about with detached fascination. How did it get so bad? He remembered thinking that about others. How did they not see it coming? Now he understood. You didn't see it coming because the people you trusted told you everything was manageable right up until the moment it wasn't. Water. The waitress's voice was quiet, barely loud enough to register. She stood beside him with the carafe, eyes on the glass in front of him, not on his face. Yes, thank you. Richard watched as she poured, her movement steady despite the tension filling the room. She had good hands, he noticed. Steady, no tremor. He wondered what her story was, how she'd ended up serving water to desperate billionaires in a club that charged $50,000 a year just for membership. He wondered if she had student loans, medical bills, family depending on her. He wondered if she ever looked at people like him and felt anything other than detached professionalism. He used to not wonder about such things. Service staff were background noise, part of the machinery that kept his world running smoothly. Meals appeared. Drinks were refreshed. Cars arrived exactly when needed. He never questioned who made those things happen because it didn't matter. They were compensated for their work. That was the exchange. That was capitalism. Now, sitting here about to sign away everything, Richard felt that same invisibility settling over himself. The lawyers weren't listening to him. They were managing him, moving him through steps like he was a problem to be processed rather than a human being with questions and concerns. He'd become the background noise in his own life. Mr. Calloway, please. Catherine Morris pushed a pen across the table toward him. It was heavy, expensive, probably cost more than that waitress made in a week. First signature, page 4, bottom right. Richard picked up the pen. His hand hovered over the page. 30 years. His father's company, rebuilt from near bankruptcy after the old man died, transformed into something worth $3 billion at its peak. Now worth nothing. Less than nothing. Negative value. A crater where an empire used to be. Page 4, Patricia repeated, her voice sharper now. Bottom right. Initial and date. The waitress moved again, this time to collect empty coffee cups from the far end of the table. Richard watched her work, saw her eyes scan the documents as she reached across. She was definitely reading them. Not pretending to clean while eavesdropping, but actually processing the information printed on those pages. Her hand paused for just a fraction of a second over a page near Marcus's briefcase. Richard couldn't see what was written there, but he saw her reaction. A tiny intake of breath, a subtle shift in posture. Something on that page had surprised her. Are you going to sign or not? Patricia's patience had evaporated entirely. Because we can have you declared mentally incompetent to make financial decisions if that's the route you want to take. That's messy, but it's an option if you're unable to execute your fiduciary responsibilities. The threat landed cold and clear. Sign, or we'll take the decision away from you entirely. Richard felt anger rise in his chest, the first real emotion he'd felt in weeks besides despair. These people weren't his advocates. They were his handlers, and maybe something worse. The waitress retreated toward the kitchen door, Her small tray of dirty cups balanced perfectly. She moved with the kind of grace that came from years of practice, never drawing attention, never disrupting. As she reached the door, she glanced back over her shoulder. Just once, her eyes met Richard's for a single second. And in that second, Richard saw something he recognized because he'd felt it himself 1,000 times in boardrooms and negotiations. She knew something important, something the people in this room didn't want anyone else to know. The door swung shut behind her with a quiet click. Mr. Calloway. Marcus's voice had taken on that dangerous calm that preceded ultimatums. Sign the papers or we walk. You can find new counsel, but you won't find them in the next 90 minutes. And without representation, you'll face the creditors alone. Richard looked down at the signature line. The pen felt impossibly heavy in his hand. Everything in this room, every person, every document, every carefully chosen word pushed him toward this moment. Sign and survive. Refuse and face destruction. But that waitress's eyes kept flashing in his mind. The way she'd paused, the way she'd looked at those papers, the way her expression had shifted when Patricia dismissed the European holdings as terminology. Something was wrong. He didn't know what. He didn't have proof. But 30 years of business instinct, dulled by panic and pressure, suddenly flickered back to life in his gut. I need a minute, Richard said, setting the pen down. You don't have a minute, Patricia shot back. Then I'll make one. Richard stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is my life you're asking me to dismantle. I'll take whatever time I need. The hallway connecting the private dining rooms to the kitchen stretched longer than it actually was. Soft lighting, thick carpet, walls decorated with oil paintings of fox hunts and sailing ships. The Sterling Reserve existed in a bubble where the real world felt distant and unimportant. Maya Jefferson pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen, the sudden noise and heat a sharp contrast to the careful quiet of the dining room she'd just left. The kitchen staff moved in organized chaos, preparing meals for the various private events happening throughout the club this afternoon. The head chef, Pierre, shouted instructions in French-accented English while sous chefs prepped vegetables and proteins with practiced efficiency. Maya set her tray down by the industrial dishwasher, her mind still replaying what she'd seen on those documents. The asset reclassification page. The European subsidiary listed as liquidated. But she'd served lunch in the club's main dining room just last week to representatives from that same subsidiary. They'd been celebrating a contract renewal, ordering champagne, talking about expansion opportunities in the Frankfurt market. Liquidated companies didn't expand. Dead businesses didn't sign new contracts. Something in those papers didn't match reality, and the lawyers had shut down the billionaire's question so quickly it felt rehearsed. Maya, you good? Carlos, one of the other servers, appeared beside her with his own tray of dishes. You look like you're solving world hunger over there. Just tired. Maya forced a smile. Long shift. Tell me about it. I bought the Anderson party in room 3, demanding fresh flowers that we don't have because someone forgot to place the order. Carlos rolled his eyes. Rich people problems. Maya nodded, not really listening. She glanced at the clock mounted above the prep station. Her break started in 5 minutes. She needed those 5 minutes. The break room was small, barely more than a closet with a table, microwave, and ancient refrigerator that hummed louder than it should. Maya grabbed her bag from her locker and pulled out a worn notebook, its cover held together with tape, pages filled with neat handwriting and calculations. She'd been studying contract law for 2 years now, taking online courses through a community college program whenever she could scrape together tuition money. Before that, she'd completed basic accounting certification, learning to read balance sheets and financial statements with the same determination she'd once applied to getting her high school diploma while working 2 jobs to help her mother with rent. Her mother. The thought always came with a sharp pain in her chest. Sandra Jefferson had lost everything to paperwork she couldn't understand. A predatory loan disguised as a business opportunity, contracts full of terms that sounded legitimate but hid clauses that slowly bled her dry. By the time Maya was old enough to help, old enough to read the documents and understand what had been done, it was too late. The house was gone. The savings were gone. Her mother's health had collapsed under the stress. Maya had sworn then, standing in an empty apartment watching her mother cry over boxes of belongings they couldn't afford to move, that she'd never be helpless again. She'd learn how the systems worked. She'd understand the language that powerful people use to take advantage of those who didn't know better. She flipped open her notebook to a blank page and wrote quickly, reconstructing from memory what she'd seen on those documents. Asset Reclassification Summary. Callaway International Holdings. Status: liquidated. Value: 0. Below that, she added what she knew from other sources. Callaway International Holdings. Last week, active contract discussions. Celebrating renewal with German firm. Staff mentioned expansion plans. The numbers didn't match. A company couldn't be both dead and growing unless someone was lying about which state it was actually in. Maya tapped her pen against the page, thinking through possibilities. Maybe the lawyers were right, and she'd misunderstood. Maybe liquidated for purposes of filing really was just terminology, a legal technicality that meant something different in bankruptcy proceedings than it meant in normal business operations. But the way that lawyer, Patricia, had dismissed Mr. Callaway's question, that sharp edge in her voice, the way she'd called it semantics, as if the billionaire was being stupid for caring, that didn't feel like patient explanation. That felt like someone shutting down an inconvenient observation before it led somewhere dangerous. Maya chewed the inside of her cheek, a habit from childhood she'd never managed to break. She was nobody in this situation. A waitress, a server, someone who brought water and removed empty plates and disappeared into the background the moment her function was complete. What she thought about those documents meant nothing. These were high-powered lawyers and a billionaire. They'd forgotten more about business than she'd ever learn. But her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Don't let anyone make you small, baby. Don't let them convince you that your eyes are lying when they're seeing the truth. Maya closed her notebook and checked the time. Her break was over. She needed to get back before Claire, the floor manager, started asking questions. Claire ran a tight operation, and servers who took too long on breaks found their shifts getting cut without explanation. She returned to the kitchen just as Pierre finished plating a salmon entree that probably cost more than her rent. The private dining rooms at the Sterling Reserve were where Manhattan's elite conducted business they didn't want conducted in offices with security cameras and recorded phone lines. Deals were made. Secrets were traded. Power changed hands over Dover sole and vintage wine. And the staff who served those meals were trained to be invisible. See nothing. Hear nothing. Remember nothing. Maya had gotten very good at being invisible. It was a survival skill, learned young and perfected over years of navigating spaces where she didn't belong by birth but needed to be for rent money. But invisibility had advantages. People said things around her they'd never say in front of someone they considered an equal. Documents were left open on tables. Conversations continued as if she wasn't standing 3 feet away. She pushed back through the swinging door into the hallway, carrying a fresh carafe of coffee and a plate of pastries that Claire had instructed her to deliver to the private dining room where Mr. Callaway and his lawyers were working. As she approached the door, she heard raised voices. Not quite shouting, but tense. Angry. She paused, hand on the door handle, listening. "This is ridiculous, Richard." That was the older lawyer, Marcus. "You're stalling because you're emotional. I understand, but emotion doesn't change mathematics. I'm stalling because something feels wrong." Mr. Callaway's voice sounded stronger than it had earlier, less defeated. "You're rushing me through the biggest decision of my life, like we're ordering lunch." "We're rushing because we have a deadline," Patricia snapped. "A deadline that you agreed to when we structured this agreement with your creditors. You can't change the rules now because you're having second thoughts." Maya pushed the door open quietly, announcing her presence with a soft knock on the doorframe. The conversation stopped immediately. All eyes turned toward her for a brief second before dismissing her as irrelevant and returning to their argument. She set the pastries down on the service table and began refilling coffee cups, moving around the table with practiced efficiency. The tension in the room was thick enough to taste. Mr. Callaway sat with his arms crossed, the bankruptcy papers untouched in front of him. The lawyers had arranged themselves like a wall across from him, a united front of professional authority. "We've been through every page," Catherine Morris said. Her tone suggesting this was the final explanation she was willing to give. "Every clause has been reviewed, explained, and approved by your personal financial advisor. This isn't a surprise, Richard. This is the plan we've been building toward for weeks." "Then why does it feel like an ambush?" Mr. Calloway asked quietly. Maya moved toward Marcus's end of the table, coffee carafe in hand. As she leaned in to refill his cup, her eyes caught on a document peeking out from his briefcase, which sat open on the chair beside him. She learned to read upside down years ago, a skill developed from years of studying, while working, stealing moments to review textbooks during shifts, processing information however she could grab it. The document showed a timeline, corporate restructuring milestones. And there, halfway down the page, was a line that made her breath catch. "Asset transfer to Meridian Trust, pending bankruptcy approval." Meridian Trust. She knew that name, not from the dining room, but from her coursework. One of her contract law classes had used it as a case study, a vehicle for corporate acquisitions that allowed buyers to purchase distressed companies at discount prices during bankruptcy proceedings. This wasn't just a bankruptcy. This was a transfer. Mr. Calloway wasn't just losing his company. He was signing it over to someone else. Maya's hand trembled slightly as she finished pouring coffee. She carefully set the carafe down, her mind racing through possibilities. Maybe this was normal. Maybe all bankruptcies work this way. Maybe she was seeing conspiracy where there was just unfortunate business reality. But her gut said otherwise. Her gut, trained by years of watching her mother get destroyed by people who smiled while they robbed her, said this was wrong. She stepped back toward the wall, her professional invisibility settling over her like armor. But her mind worked furiously behind her neutral expression, connecting pieces, building a picture that grew darker the more complete it became. "James," Mr. Calloway turned to the quiet lawyer with wire-rimmed glasses. "You've been silent this whole time. What do you think?" James Hartford blinked, clearly uncomfortable being put on the spot. "I think my colleagues have explained the situation thoroughly." "That's not what I asked. I asked what you think." A long pause. James glanced at Marcus, then Patricia, then back to Mr. Calloway. "I think bankruptcy is complex and emotional. I think you're making the best choice available given the circumstances." The answer was careful, practiced, and completely meaningless. Maya watched Mr. Calloway's face change, saw the moment when suspicion crystallized into something closer to certainty. He was a smart man, she realized. Successful people didn't build billion-dollar companies by being stupid. He'd been beaten down, overwhelmed, pushed to the edge of his limits by circumstances he didn't fully understand. But he wasn't gone yet. "I need independent counsel," Mr. Calloway said suddenly. "Someone not connected to my current legal representation. Someone who can review these documents without any prior relationship to my case." The room went very still. Marcus set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Richard, we are your independent counsel. We were recommended to you by my previous attorney, who disappeared the moment things got difficult." Mr. Calloway interrupted. "I want someone else to look at this. Someone with no skin in the game." "There's no time," Patricia said flatly. "You have 45 minutes before the creditor's agreement expires. You think you can find a qualified bankruptcy attorney, bring them up to speed, have them review hundreds of pages of documents, and make an informed decision in 45 minutes. Put like that, it sounded impossible. It probably was impossible. Maya's fingers curled into a fist at her side. She could stay quiet. She could finish her shift, collect her paycheck, go home to her tiny studio apartment, and forget she'd seen anything. That was the smart play, the safe play. Getting involved in Billionaire's business was a great way to lose the job she desperately needed. But her mother's voice wouldn't stop echoing in her head. Don't let them convince you that your eyes are lying. And her eyes were showing her a man being cornered by people he trusted, rushed into a decision that would destroy him, while a piece of paper tucked in a briefcase revealed this wasn't salvation. It was theft dressed in legal language. Maya took a slow breath, feeling her heart pound against her ribs. This was stupid. This was going to cost her. but staying silent would cost something else, something she wasn't willing to pay. She moved forward, her hand shaking slightly as she reached for a napkin from the service table. She pulled a pen from her pocket, the cheap ballpoint she used to take orders. And in small, neat handwriting, she wrote 5 words. Page 14, Section C, Asset Active. She folded the napkin once and set it down on the table, directly in front of Mr. Calloway's right hand. Then she stepped back, heart hammering, waiting to see if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. Mr. Calloway looked down at the napkin, frowned, unfolded it. His eyes scanned the words, then lifted to meet hers. The room seemed to freeze around them, that single moment stretching into something much larger than 5 words on a napkin should create. Who wrote this? Mr. Calloway's voice was quiet, careful. Maya's throat felt dry, but she forced the words out. I did, sir. Every lawyer in the room turned to stare at her. Not dismissive glances this time. Real attention, and not the friendly kind. The tension following Maya's note hung in the air like a physical presence. Richard Calloway stared at the napkin in his hand, those 5 words written in neat, precise handwriting. Page 14, Section C, Asset Active. His eyes lifted slowly from the paper to meet Maya's gaze, and for the first time in months, something other than despair flickered in his expression. Excuse me. Patricia Vance's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Did you just interrupt a private legal proceeding? Maya felt every muscle in her body tense, but she kept her voice steady. I apologize if I overstepped, ma'am. I just noticed something that seemed inconsistent. Inconsistent? Marcus Webb stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. You're a waitress. What exactly do you think you noticed that 4 attorneys with over 80 years of combined legal experience missed? The dismissal in his tone was absolute. The kind of casual contempt that didn't even register as insulting because it was simply stating what he believed to be fact. Maya had heard that tone her entire life. In classrooms where teachers assumed she wouldn't understand advanced concepts, in offices where supervisors assigned her the simplest tasks, in 1,000 tiny moments where people looked at her uniform, her skin, her position in the world, and decided they already knew everything about what she was capable of understanding. I have some background in contract review, Maya said quietly. Enough to notice when documents contradict each other. Catherine Morris laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. Contract review? Did you take an online course or something? This is complex corporate bankruptcy law. It's not something you pick up from YouTube videos. Richard raised his hand, silencing the lawyers. His eyes never left Maya's face. What did you notice? Mr. Calloway, this is completely inappropriate. James Hartford finally spoke up, his voice strained. We cannot have staff members commenting on confidential legal documents. This could compromise the entire proceeding. Asked her a question. Richard's voice had an edge now, the first hint of the authority that had once commanded boardrooms and negotiating tables. What did you notice? Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct told her to back down, apologize, retreat to safety. But she'd already crossed the line. There was no going back now. Page 14, she said, her voice gaining strength. Section C lists your European subsidiary, Calloway International Holdings, as liquidated with 0 value. But I served lunch last week to representatives from that company. They were celebrating a contract renewal with a German manufacturing firm. They were discussing expansion plans. The room went completely still. Patricia recovered first, her smile tight and cold. Corporate celebrations don't mean a company is solvent. They were probably trying to maintain morale before the inevitable collapse. It's common in failing businesses. The contract they signed was worth 12 million euros over 3 years. Maya continued, feeling momentum build despite her fear. That's approximately 13 million American dollars. The documents in front of Mr. Calloway list that entire division as having 0 value. Even if the subsidiary had debts, a contract of that size would represent some asset value. Marcus's face had gone rigid. How do you know the contract terms? The representatives were discussing it openly in the dining room. They weren't being secretive about it. Hearsay from overheard conversation is hardly evidence. Catherine interjected quickly. You have no documentation, no verification. You're repeating gossip and presenting it as fact. Richard flipped through the papers on the table, his movements quick and focused now. He found page 14 and pulled it free from the stack. She's right. It says liquidated. Zero value. But I received a quarterly report from European operations 3 weeks ago showing positive cash flow. He looked up at Marcus. Why would a profitable division be listed as worthless? Because in bankruptcy proceedings, all assets are evaluated against total liability. Marcus said, his tone shifting to careful patience. Yes, the subsidiary has some revenue, but it also has operational costs, debt obligations, and exposure to parent company liabilities. When you factor in the complete picture, the net value is effectively zero. That's not how asset valuation works in Chapter 11, Maya said before she could stop herself. Individual subsidiaries with independent operations are evaluated separately from parent company debt unless there's direct liability transfer. Every head turned toward her. I'm sorry, Patricia's voice dripped with condescension. Are you actually trying to lecture us on bankruptcy law? You serve coffee for a living. I study contract law at Brooklyn Community College, Maya said, lifting her chin. I've completed courses in corporate structure, asset evaluation, and creditor relationships. I know I'm not an attorney, but I can read these documents well enough to see when something doesn't add up. Richard was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, but also something else. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone seeing another person clearly for the first time instead of looking through them. Everyone be quiet for a moment, Richard said, his voice carrying real command now. He turned back to the papers, scanning pages with new focus. Where's the complete asset breakdown? The detailed list of what's being liquidated and what's being distributed. Page 28, James offered, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard flipped to it, his finger tracing down columns of text. Maya could see his expression changing, confusion giving way to something harder. Anger, she realized. Cold, focused anger. This lists my personal real estate holdings as part of the bankruptcy estate, Richard said slowly. My home in Connecticut, my apartment here in Manhattan, even the property in Colorado that's held in my wife's trust. How are those part of this filing? Marital property is always considered in bankruptcy, Patricia said, but her tone had lost some of its certainty. Not property held in independent trusts established before marriage, Maya said quietly. That's protected under separate property doctrine unless there's proven commingling of assets. Marcus rounded on her, his professional mask slipping. This is not your concern. I'm going to have to ask you to leave this room immediately, or I will have security remove you. She can stay, Richard said flatly. This is a private room I'm paying for. If I want her here, she stays. Richard, you're not thinking clearly. Catherine tried a softer approach. The stress of this situation is making you paranoid. We are your legal team. We're on your side. This young woman, however well-meaning, is causing confusion where there shouldn't be any. Then help me understand something. Richard's voice was dangerously calm now. If this is straightforward bankruptcy protection, why does Section 7 reference asset transfer pending court approval? Transfer to whom? The silence that followed was deafening. That's standard language, Marcus said finally, but he wasn't meeting Richard's eyes anymore. Transfer to whom? Richard repeated, each word precise and hard. Maya saw James Hartford shift uncomfortably in his seat. Catherine was suddenly very interested in her own paperwork. Patricia's jaw was tight, muscles working beneath her skin. It was Marcus who finally answered, and the smoothness had gone from his voice. To a restructuring trust. It's a vehicle for managing assets during bankruptcy proceedings. Once the court approves your filing, a trustee takes control of the estate to ensure fair distribution to creditors. Meridian Trust? Maya asked, the name from the document in Marcus's briefcase burning in her memory. Every lawyer in the room froze. How do you know that name? Marcus's voice was barely controlled fury now. I saw it on a document, Maya said simply. In your briefcase. You were reading my private papers? Marcus took a step toward her, his face flushed. I was refilling your coffee. Maya stood her ground. The document was visible. I have good eyes. Richard stood up so quickly his chair nearly toppled backward. Someone explain to me right now what Meridian Trust is and why my assets are being transferred to it. The lawyers exchanged glances, a silent conversation happening in the space between them. It was the kind of look people shared when they were deciding how much truth they could afford to tell. Meridian Trust is a standard bankruptcy vehicle, Patricia said carefully. It's used in complex corporate restructurings. It's also used for corporate acquisitions, Maya interjected. It's a way for buyers to purchase distressed companies at discount prices during bankruptcy. We studied it in my corporate structure class. The target company declares bankruptcy. Assets get transferred to the trust at reduced valuation, and then the trust sells to prearranged buyers for pennies on the dollar. The blood had drained from Richard's face. Are you telling me this isn't bankruptcy protection? This is a sale? I'm signing over my company to someone else. That's an absurd oversimplification, Catherine said quickly. The legal reality is far more nuanced. Then explain the nuance. Richard's voice was ice now. In simple terms, who ends up controlling my assets after I sign these papers? No one answered. Richard turned to James, the quiet lawyer who'd barely spoken. James, you've been silent through all of this. I want the truth from you. Right now, who benefits from this bankruptcy? James Hartford looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his glasses and cleaned them with his tie. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. The trust will control asset distribution, subject to court approval and creditor claims. That's not what I asked. I can't speculate on eventual outcomes. Can't or won't. Richard leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. Because I'm starting to think there's a very specific outcome here, and the only person who doesn't know about it is me. Marcus Webb straightened his tie, his expression hardening into something cold and professional. Mr. Calloway, you're creating a conspiracy theory out of standard legal procedures. Your situation is difficult, I understand that. But attacking your own legal team because you're emotional is not productive. Then produce the trust documents, Richard said. Show me exactly how Meridian Trust operates, who controls it, and who benefits from the asset transfers. Those documents are part of the court filing package, Patricia said. They're included in the materials you're about to sign. Show me now, before I sign anything. Marcus's smile was thin and sharp. We're down to 38 minutes, Richard. We don't have time for this. Make time. The lawyers didn't move. That, more than anything else, confirmed Richard's suspicions. If the documents were readily available and contained nothing problematic, they'd simply produce them to ease his concerns and move forward. The refusal, dressed up as time pressure, meant something was being hidden. Richard turned to Maya, who still stood near the wall, her posture rigid with tension. You said you study this. How would I verify the trust structure? The trust formation documents should show the beneficiaries and control structure, Maya said, her voice steadier now. If it's truly a bankruptcy vehicle, it would be overseen by the court with no predetermined beneficiaries. If it's an acquisition vehicle, there would be named parties with financial interest in the asset purchase. This is completely inappropriate. Catherine stood up abruptly. Mr. Calloway, we cannot continue this meeting with a service employee providing you with legal analysis. This is malpractice waiting to happen. Either she leaves or we do. Then leave, Richard said quietly. The lawyers stared at him. I said leave. All of you. This meeting is over. Marcus's carefully controlled expression cracked. You can't dismiss us. We have an agreement. We've put weeks into this case. You have obligations. I have no obligations to people who are lying to me. Richard's voice rose for the first time, genuine fury breaking through. Get out, now, and leave those papers. These are our work product. Patricia grabbed for the documents, but Richard's hand slammed down on the stack, holding them in place. These are documents about my company, my assets, my life. They stay. For a moment, Maya thought Marcus might actually try to physically take the papers. His hand twitched toward them, his face twisted with barely controlled rage. But something in Richard's expression, that flash of the powerful man he'd once been, made the lawyer step back. You're making a catastrophic mistake, Marcus said, his voice tight. Without representation, without this filing, you will lose everything. Your creditors will tear you apart. Your family will suffer. And it will all be because you listened to a waitress playing lawyer. I'd rather lose everything to honest creditors than sign it away to thieves in suits, Richard said. Get out. The lawyers gathered their briefcases with sharp, angry movements. Patricia glared at Maya with such venom that Maya instinctively took a step back. Catherine muttered something under her breath that sounded like lawsuit. James Hartford wouldn't meet anyone's eyes at all. Marcus paused at the door, turning back with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You have 25 minutes until that creditor's agreement expires, Richard. 25 minutes to find new counsel, review hundreds of pages of complex legal documents, and make a decision that will determine whether you have anything left or lose it all. Good luck with that. The door closed behind them with a heavy click. The silence that followed felt immense. Richard stood at the table, both hands braced against its surface, his head bowed. Maya remained by the wall, suddenly very aware that she was alone in a room with a desperate billionaire whose life she'd just helped explode. Mr. Calloway, she started, her voice uncertain. I'm sorry if I... Don't apologize. Richard lifted his head, and Maya was startled to see he was almost smiling. It wasn't a happy expression, but it was alive in a way his face hadn't been before. You just saved me from signing away everything to people who were robbing me blind. If anyone should apologize, it's me for almost being too blind to see it. He pulled out a chair and sank into it, suddenly looking exhausted. Though Marcus was right about one thing. I have no representation now, no time to get any, and no clear path forward. So maybe I just traded one disaster for a slightly more honest disaster. Maya hesitated, then slowly moved closer to the table. May I look at the documents? You want to review bankruptcy papers for a company you don't work for, to help a man you don't know, when you could get fired just for being in this room? Richard laughed, a slightly unhinged sound. Why would you do that? Maya thought of her mother, of empty apartments and predatory contracts, and powerful people who smiled while they destroyed lives. Because someone should have done it for my mother, and because those lawyers were lying, and I really don't like liars. Richard studied her for a long moment, then pushed the stack of documents across the table. Then let's see what they were trying to hide. Maya pulled out a chair and sat down, her hands already reaching for the first page. Up close, the documents were even more complex than she'd seen from a distance. Dense legal language, cross-references to other sections, terminology that required real expertise to parse. But she learned to read through complexity, to find the truth buried in jargon. Here, she pointed to a section near the top of the asset reclassification page. This clause says all assets will be transferred to Meridian Trust for valuation and distribution. That sounds neutral until you read the footnote. Richard leaned in, squinting at the small print. Valuation to be determined by trust-appointed assessors at fair market value as of filing date. Right. And the filing date was chosen for 6 months after your financial troubles became public, which means the valuation will reflect your company at its lowest point, not its actual worth. So they're valuing everything when it's worth the least. Exactly. Then look at this. Maya flipped to another page, her finger tracing a line of text. Distribution priority. Secured creditors first, which is normal. But then it says unsecured creditors and trust administrative fees. What's wrong with that? Administrative fees are usually a small percentage, but this doesn't cap them. They could claim half the remaining assets as fees, and it would be legal under this language. Richard's jaw tightened. So after secured creditors take their share, the trust takes whatever it wants in fees, and I get whatever's left, which would be nothing, probably less than nothing. You'd still have personal liability for any shortfalls. Maya kept reading, her mind working through implications. But here's the real problem. Page 41. Trust beneficiary structure. She found the page and turned it so Richard could see. The language was deliberately obscure, buried in a paragraph about fiduciary responsibilities and oversight requirements. But once he knew what to look for, it was clear. Meridian Trust is controlled by a board of directors appointed by primary creditors, Maya read aloud. And the primary creditors in your case are listed as North Point Capital, Sterling Financial Group, and Webb Holdings, LLC. Webb Holdings? Richard's face went pale. Marcus Webb? I need to verify, but that's a pretty specific name. I'm guessing Webb Holdings is connected to your lawyer in some way. Maya flipped back to earlier pages, cross-referencing. And look at this. 3 months ago, North Point Capital acquired a significant position in your company's debt by purchasing distressed bonds at 20 cents on the dollar. Someone was buying up my debt when I was at my weakest, and now that debt gives them control over the trust that's taking your assets. Maya sat back, the full picture crystallizing in her mind. This wasn't bankruptcy protection, Mr. Calloway. This was a hostile takeover dressed up as legal salvation. They engineered your collapse, bought your debt for cheap, and then offered you a solution that would transfer everything to a trust they control. You would sign away your company, and they'd acquire it for a fraction of its value. Richard closed his eyes, his hands curling into fists on the table. Who's behind this? Maya scanned the documents again, looking for names, connections, anything that would reveal the mastermind. Then she saw it, buried in a disclosure section most people would skip over. A footnote about potential conflicts of interest. It says here that North Point Capital is a subsidiary of Thornton Enterprises. She looked up at Richard. Does that name mean anything to you? Richard's expression went from confusion to recognition to rage in the space of a heartbeat. Thomas Thornton. I forced him out of the company 8 years ago. He wanted to strip assets and sell divisions for quick profit. I wouldn't let him, so I bought out his stake and removed him from the board. Looks like he found a way to take everything after all. Maya closed the documents, feeling sick. This was planned, probably for years. He bought debt, pressured your partners to abandon you, triggered lawsuits to freeze your accounts, and then had his lawyers offer you salvation that was actually surrender. And I almost signed it, Richard said quietly. I was 10 seconds away from handing him everything on a silver platter. But you didn't. Maya met his eyes. You asked questions. You listened when something didn't make sense. That's why you still have a chance. Richard looked at the clock on the wall. 18 minutes until the creditor's agreement expired. A chance to do what? Even if I don't sign this bankruptcy, I still have frozen accounts, pending lawsuits, and creditors who will come after everything I have. Then you fight them, Maya said simply. You expose what they try to do. You file countersuits for fraud and conspiracy. You go public with the evidence. Maybe you lose, but you lose fighting instead of surrendering to thieves. I need lawyers for that. Real ones. And I have no idea who to trust anymore. Maya pulled out her phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen. My contract law professor worked as a corporate attorney before she started teaching. She always said if we ever needed real help, she had connections to people who actually cared about justice instead of just billing hours. She had sent out an email, then looked up at Richard. I can't promise anything, but maybe she knows someone who can help. Someone who isn't connected to Thornton or his people. Richard stared at her, this waitress he'd barely noticed an hour ago, who'd risked her job to hand him a napkin with 5 words that changed everything. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. For all you know, I deserve what's happening. Maya thought about that, about all the times she'd served meals to people who treated her like furniture, who discussed deals and schemes and power plays as if she didn't exist. Maybe you do deserve some of it, she said honestly. I don't know your whole story, but I know what they were trying to do was wrong. And I know my mother would tell me that doing nothing when you see wrong is the same as helping it happen. Richard's phone buzzed. Then again, text messages appearing in rapid succession. He glanced at the screen, and his expression darkened. Marcus. He's threatening to file an emergency motion claiming I'm mentally incompetent to make financial decisions. Says he'll have me declared unfit and petition for a court-appointed guardian to handle my affairs. Can he do that? I don't know. Richard looked at Maya, and she saw real fear in his eyes now. But if he can, I lose control completely. A court-appointed guardian would probably just sign those bankruptcy papers for me. Maya's phone buzzed with a reply. She read it quickly, hope rising in her chest. Professor Chin knows someone. an attorney named Elizabeth Reeves, who specializes in corporate fraud cases. She's 15 minutes away and willing to meet with you. 15 minutes, and I have 18 before everything explodes. That's cutting it close. It's a chance, Maya said, which is better than what you had 10 minutes ago. Richard looked at the documents spread across the table, then at Maya, then at his phone lighting up with more threatening messages from Marcus Webb. Finally, he stood up, squaring his shoulders. Tell your professor's contact. I'll meet her in the lobby in 5 minutes. And Maya, he extended his hand across the table. Thank you for seeing what needed to be seen, for having the courage to speak when it would have been safer to stay silent. Maya shook his hand, feeling the weight of what she'd just set in motion. She'd probably lost her job. She'd definitely made powerful enemies. But she'd also stopped a theft disguised as legal process, and maybe that was worth it. There's one more thing, Maya said as Richard gathered his papers. If they were willing to go this far to take your company, they're not going to just give up because you walked away from signing. They'll come at you another way. Richard's smile was grim. Then they'd better be ready for a fight, because I spent 30 years building something real, and I'm not handing it over to a vindictive ex-partner and his corrupt lawyers without making them earn every dollar. He headed for the door, then paused and turned back. This conversation never ends, you know? After today, win or lose, I'm going to owe you a debt I can never properly repay. I hope you know that. Just make sure you win, Maya said simply. That's payment enough. As Richard left, Maya stood alone in the dining room, surrounded by documents that detailed a conspiracy of greed and betrayal. Her phone buzzed again. Claire, the floor manager, demanding to know where she was and why she wasn't covering her tables. Maya looked at the message, then at the papers on the table, then out the window at the city spreading below. She'd crossed a line today. There was no going back to invisible Waitress who noticed nothing and said less. Whatever came next, she'd face it with the same principle her mother had tried to teach her through all those hard years. The truth matters. Speaking up matters. And sometimes, the person who sees clearly is the person nobody expects to be paying attention at all. The lobby of the Sterling Reserve hummed with the quiet efficiency of old money and established power. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, their light reflecting off marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Members in expensive suits moved through the space with the casual confidence of people who'd never questioned their right to be anywhere. Richard Calloway stood near the entrance, his stack of documents tucked under one arm, checking his phone for the 4th time in 2 minutes. 13 minutes until the creditor's agreement expired. 13 minutes to find a way forward that didn't involve surrendering everything to Thomas Thornton's elaborate trap. His phone buzzed with another message from Marcus Webb. This one was different from the threats that had come before. Calmer, almost friendly. Richard, I understand you're upset. The pressure of this situation would shake anyone. Let's take a breath, have a conversation, and work through this together. No need to make rash decisions that can't be undone. We're still your team. We still want to help. The message made Richard's skin crawl. The shift from aggressive threats to gentle concern felt calculated, like a predator changing tactics when the first approach failed. Marcus was regrouping, and that made him more dangerous, not less. The glass doors swung open, and a woman entered with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she didn't waste time on unnecessary movements. She was in her mid-40s, black, wearing a charcoal gray suit that managed to look both professional and slightly rumpled, as if she'd thrown it on while running out the door. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a leather briefcase that showed years of use. Mr. Calloway? She approached him directly, her eyes sharp and assessing. I'm Elizabeth Reeves. Professor Chun said you needed help with a bankruptcy filing that wasn't what it appeared to be. Richard felt something unknot in his chest. She'd come, an actual attorney who had no connection to Thornton, no financial stake in his destruction, just a willingness to help because someone she trusted had asked. Thank you for coming on such short notice. I know this is. We can talk while we find somewhere private, Elizabeth interrupted, already scanning the lobby. You said you have the documents? Good. I need to see them immediately. How much time do we have? 12 minutes before the creditor's agreement expires. Elizabeth's eyebrows rose. Then we'd better move fast. Is there a conference room we can use? Richard gestured toward the member services desk. I'll arrange something. 5 minutes later, they were seated in a small conference room on the second floor, documents spread across the table between them. Elizabeth had pulled reading glasses from her briefcase and was scanning pages with practiced speed, her finger tracking lines of text while her other hand made quick notes on a legal pad. Maya had followed them up, hovering uncertainly near the door. She'd left her station without permission, abandoned her tables, probably sealed the end of her employment at the Sterling Reserve. But she needed to see this through, needed to know if the risk she'd taken had mattered. This is elegantly vicious, Elizabeth said after 3 minutes of silent reading. Whoever structured this knew exactly what they were doing. The language is technically legal, but functionally fraudulent. It's designed to look like standard bankruptcy protection while actually facilitating asset transfer at below-market valuation. Can we stop it? Richard asked. Elizabeth looked up, her expression serious. That depends on several factors. First, are you prepared for a legal war? Because once we move against this, Thornton and his people will come at you with everything they have. They've already taken everything I have. Not quite. You still have your reputation, your freedom, and some assets they haven't touched yet. A prolonged legal battle could cost you all three. Elizabeth set down her glasses. I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm making sure you understand what you're choosing. Richard thought about the last 6 months, the steady erosion of everything he'd built, the feeling of drowning while people he trusted told him to stop fighting and just let go. He thought about Marcus Webb's smile, about Thomas Thornton somewhere laughing at how easily his revenge had unfolded, about the moment 10 minutes from now when that creditor's agreement would expire and the real feeding frenzy would begin. I'm done being victim, Richard said quietly. Whatever fight this takes, I'm ready. Elizabeth nodded once, then turned back to the documents. Then here's what we do. We can't stop the creditor's agreement from expiring, but we can change what happens after. I'll file an emergency motion with the bankruptcy court alleging fraud in the preparation of these documents. We'll request an immediate hearing and a temporary restraining order preventing any asset transfers until the court can review the evidence of conspiracy. Will that work? It'll buy us time. Maybe a week, maybe a month. Enough to build a proper case. Elizabeth pulled out her phone and started typing rapidly. I'm contacting my paralegal now. We'll need affidavits, financial records, communication logs, anything that shows the pattern of manipulation that led to your financial crisis. Maya stepped forward from the doorway. The lawyers who prepared these documents, they were pressuring Mr. Calloway to sign without proper review. They refused to explain key sections. They threatened him when he questioned inconsistencies. Elizabeth looked at Maya with new interest. You witnessed this? I was serving in the room. I heard everything. Good. I'll need a written statement from you detailing exactly what you saw and heard. Your testimony as a neutral third party could be crucial. Elizabeth turned back to Richard. What about your former legal counsel? The attorney who originally referred you to Webb and Associates. David Preston. He withdrew from representation 2 months ago. Said there was a conflict of interest, but wouldn't explain what kind. That's suspicious timing. We'll subpoena his records. Elizabeth was writing notes faster now, building a strategy in real time. What about your business partners? The ones who withdrew their capital right before your collapse. 3 primary partners. Stephen Marsh, Jennifer Park, and Robert Klein. We'd worked together for over a decade. Then suddenly, all 3 pulled out within the same week, citing concerns about company direction. Orchestrated, Elizabeth said flatly. I'd bet money Thornton approached them individually, probably offered them something to abandon you at a critical moment. We'll need to depose all 3. Richard's phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Marcus. It was a number he didn't recognize, but the message made his blood run cold. Mr. Calloway, this is Judge Patricia Morrison's clerk. Your legal counsel has filed an emergency petition for competency evaluation. A hearing has been scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9. You are required to appear. Elizabeth saw Richard's expression change. What is it? He handed her the phone. She read the message, her jaw tightening. They're moving fast. Competency evaluation is their nuclear option. If they can convince a judge you're not mentally fit to make financial decisions, they'll get a guardian appointed who'll sign those bankruptcy papers for you. Can they actually do that? Maya asked, her voice tight with worry. They can try. The standard is high, but with enough pressure and the right judge, they might succeed. Elizabeth looked at Richard. Do you have any history of mental health treatment? Anything they could use against you? I saw a therapist 3 years ago after my father died. Grief counseling. Nothing else. They'll try to spin it as depression affecting your judgment. We'll need a psychiatric evaluation from our own expert to counter it. Elizabeth checked her watch. 7 minutes until your agreement expires. Here's what happens next. The moment that deadline hits, you'll start receiving calls from creditors, lawyers, maybe media. Don't answer any of them. Refer everything to me. I'm officially your legal counsel as of right now. She pulled a document from her briefcase and slid it across the table with a pen. Standard representation agreement. Sign here and here. My retainer is $25,000, but given the circumstances, I'll take whatever you can actually access right now, and we'll figure out the rest later. Richard scanned the document quickly. It was straightforward, nothing hidden in the language, just a clear statement of representation and responsibilities. He signed both copies and pushed them back. My personal accounts are frozen, but I have a small emergency fund my wife set up in her name. I can probably get you $15,000 within the next few days. That works. Now, about tomorrow's hearing. Elizabeth gathered the bankruptcy documents back into a neat stack. They'll argue you're making irrational decisions, refusing competent legal advice, and showing poor judgment. We argue you're exercising reasonable caution after discovering evidence of fraud. Maya's testimony will be key. If she can establish that you are asking valid questions and receiving evasive answers, it supports your mental competence. I'll testify, Maya said immediately. Whatever you need. Elizabeth studied her for a moment. You understand you're putting yourself at risk? Powerful people are going to be very angry with you. They might come after your job, your reputation, maybe worse. Maya thought about her tiny apartment, her night classes, the careful budget that barely stretched from paycheck to paycheck. She thought about how easily it could all disappear with a few phone calls from the right people to the right managers. Then she thought about her mother's face, the resignation in her eyes when she'd finally understood how completely she'd been cheated. I understand, Maya said simply, but I also understand what happens when good people see wrong and decide it's not their problem. Someone has to stand up. Richard looked at this young woman who'd risked everything to hand him a napkin with 5 words, who'd stood her ground against lawyers who tried to dismiss and intimidate her, who was now volunteering to fight beside him against people who could destroy her future with barely any effort at all. Why? He asked quietly. I need to understand why you're doing this. Maya met his eyes steadily. Because my mother lost everything to people like them. Because I'm tired of watching the powerful take whatever they want while everyone else just looks away. And because you actually listened when I spoke, which means maybe you're different from what I expected. Richard's phone started buzzing. Then again. Then continuously, a cascade of incoming calls and messages as the 7-minute mark passed and the creditor's agreement officially expired. Elizabeth reached over and turned the phone face down on the table. Let them wait, she said calmly. We have work to do. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray, cold rain that made Manhattan feel particularly unforgiving. Maya stood outside the courthouse, her umbrella doing little to keep the wind-driven water from soaking through her jacket. She'd been awake most of the night, preparing her written statement with Elizabeth's guidance, going over the facts again and again until they were locked in her memory. She hadn't been back to the Sterling Reserve since yesterday afternoon. Claire had called her phone 16 times, each voicemail progressively angrier. The final one had been brief and final. Don't bother coming back. Your position has been terminated effective immediately. Security will mail you any personal items from your locker. 12 hours. That's how long it had taken for her small act of speaking truth to cost her the job she needed to pay rent, to fund her classes, to keep the fragile stability of her life intact. Maya felt the fear like a physical weight in her stomach, but she pushed it down and climbed the courthouse steps. Inside, Elizabeth waited in the hallway outside the courtroom, reviewing notes on her tablet. She looked up as Maya approached, her expression sympathetic. "I heard about your job," Elizabeth said quietly. "I'm sorry. It was always going to happen." Maya tried to keep her voice steady. "They made that clear yesterday. At least this way I know why I lost it. If we win this, Richard will make sure you're taken care of. He already told me he wants to offer you a position. I don't want charity." The words came out sharper than Maya intended. "I want to finish my degree, find work I earn on my own merit, not because I got caught up in someone else's drama." Elizabeth smiled slightly. "That's exactly what he thought you'd say, which is why he's offering to fund your education, not give you a job. Tuition, books, living expenses until you graduate. After that, you make your own way. Considerate payment for expert consulting services rendered." Before Maya could respond, the courtroom doors opened and Richard emerged, looking exhausted but alert. He'd shaved and dressed in a fresh suit, but the strain of the last 24 hours showed in the shadows under his eyes and the tightness around his mouth. "They're already inside," Richard said. "Marcus, Patricia, and 2 other lawyers I don't recognize. Plus Thomas Thornton himself, sitting in the back row like he's enjoying a show." Maya felt her stomach twist. She'd never met Thornton, only heard his name, but knowing he was there watching felt like a threat wrapped in observational innocence. "Let him watch," Elizabeth said calmly. "We've got a strong case. Judge Morrison is tough, but fair. She won't tolerate nonsense from either side." They entered the courtroom together. It was smaller than Maya had expected from television, with simple wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly washed out. Marcus Webb sat at one table with his team, their expressions confident and professional. At the back of the room, a man in his 60s with silver hair and an expensive suit watched them enter with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thomas Thornton. Judge Morrison entered from her chambers, a stern-looking woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight. Everyone stood, then sat when she gestured for them to do so. "Let's be clear about what we're doing here," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying authority without raising volume. "This is a competency evaluation hearing, not a trial. Mr. Webb, you filed a petition claiming your former client is mentally unfit to make financial decisions. That's a serious allegation. I want to hear your evidence, and then I'll hear from Mr. Calloway and his new counsel. Keep it factual and relevant. I have 4 other cases today, and no patience for theatrics." Marcus stood, his posture radiating respectful professionalism. "Thank you, Your Honor. The evidence is straightforward." Mr. Calloway was presented with a comprehensive bankruptcy filing prepared by experienced counsel after weeks of careful analysis. This filing represented his best and only realistic path to protect his remaining assets and satisfy his creditors. At the last moment, based on input from a restaurant server with no legal credentials, Mr. Calloway refused to sign, dismissed his legal team, and now alleges a conspiracy that has no basis in fact. A restaurant server? Judge Morrison looked at Maya with raised eyebrows. "A student of contract law who identified multiple fraudulent elements in documents your petitioner's firm prepared." Elizabeth stood to respond. "Elements that constitute criminal conspiracy to commit fraud through false bankruptcy filings." The courtroom went very still. Marcus's confident expression flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "That's a serious accusation, Ms. Reeves," Judge Morrison said. "I hope you have evidence to support it." "I do, Your Honor. May I present our witness?" Judge Morrison nodded. Maya was sworn in and took her seat in the witness box, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Elizabeth approached with a gentle expression that made Maya feel slightly less terrified. "Ms. Jefferson, please tell the court what you observed yesterday at the Sterling Reserve." Maya took a breath and began. She described serving water and coffee, overhearing the conversation, noticing the inconsistency in the document labeling Calloway International Holdings as liquidated. She explained her educational background, her studies in contract law and corporate structure. She detailed how the lawyers had responded to Richard's questions with evasive answers and increasing hostility. They didn't want to explain, Maya said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. They wanted him to sign without understanding. When I pointed out the inconsistency, they tried to dismiss me as unqualified. When Mr. Calloway insisted on answers, they threatened him. That's not how honest lawyers treat clients they're trying to help. Marcus stood for cross-examination, his smile sharp and cold. Ms. Jefferson, you study contract law at a community college. Is that correct? Yes. Not law school. Not even a 4-year university. Community college. That's where I can afford to study, Maya said evenly. It doesn't make the education less valid, but it does make you significantly less qualified than the 4 attorneys who prepared those bankruptcy documents, doesn't it? Combined, we have 87 years of legal experience. You have what? 2 years of night classes. I have 2 years of learning to read what's actually written instead of what people want me to believe is written, Maya replied. And in this case, what was actually written was a fraud. Judge Morrison leaned forward. Ms. Jefferson, can you specifically identify what elements you believe constituted fraud? Maya nodded and pulled out her notes. 3 primary elements, Your Honor. First, the asset reclassification listed active subsidiaries as liquidated with 0 value, which artificially deflated the bankruptcy estate's worth. Second, the trust structure named Meridian Trust as the receiving entity without disclosing that Meridian is controlled by North Point Capital, which had purchased Mr. Calloway's debt at significant discount. Third, the fee structure for trust administration had no cap, allowing the trust operators to claim unlimited compensation before any distribution to Mr. Calloway. She looked directly at Marcus as she continued. Taken together, these elements create a structure where Mr. Calloway signs away his assets to a trust controlled by his enemies. Those assets are valued at artificially low prices, and the trust operators take most of what's left in fees. Mr. Calloway would lose everything while his creditors, who are actually his business enemies, acquire his company for pennies on the dollar. That's not bankruptcy protection. That's theft disguised as legal process. The silence that followed felt heavy. Judge Morrison was writing notes, her expression unreadable. Marcus had lost his confident smile entirely. In the back row, Thomas Thornton was no longer watching with amusement. He looked like a man watching his careful plans unravel in real time. Mr. Webb, Judge Morrison said without looking up from her notes, I'm going to need you to explain the relationship between your firm and North Point Capital. And I'm going to need documentation of the trust structure Ms. Jefferson just described. Your Honor, those are confidential client materials. Marcus started. Not anymore, they're not. This court is now investigating potential fraud in bankruptcy proceedings. You will produce all documents related to Meridian Trust, North Point Capital, and any communications with Thomas Thornton within 48 hours, or I will hold you in contempt. Judge Morrison's voice was ice. Furthermore, this competency petition is denied. Mr. Calloway has demonstrated exactly the kind of reasonable caution and critical thinking I'd want to see from someone facing complex financial decisions. Asking hard questions about documents that may be fraudulent is not evidence of mental incompetence. It's evidence of basic intelligence. She turned to Elizabeth. Ms. Reeves, file your formal fraud complaint with supporting documentation. I'm ordering a full forensic review of the bankruptcy documents in question and freezing all asset transfers pending investigation. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent courtroom. Maya stepped down from the witness stand on shaking legs. She just testified against powerful lawyers in open court, had called their work fraudulent to a judge's face, had helped blow up what was probably a multi-million-dollar scheme. The implications were only starting to settle in her mind. Richard was waiting for her in the hallway, his expression a mix of relief and something deeper. Gratitude, maybe, or respect. You just saved my life, he said quietly. Again, I just told the truth, Maya replied. That shouldn't be rare enough to call heroic. In my world, it is. Richard glanced back toward the courtroom, where Marcus and his team were emerging with tight, angry faces. Thornton followed them, his expression cold and calculating. "They're not going to forgive this. Any of us." "I know." Maya watched the lawyers pass without acknowledging them, their silence more threatening than any words could be. But at least now they have to fight fair, or at least fight in public where people can see what they're doing. Elizabeth joined them, her briefcase packed and her expression satisfied. That went better than expected. Morrison is old school. She hates fraud, and she really hates lawyers who abuse their positions. She'll dig into this personally, which means Thornton's scheme is over. "What happens now?" Richard asked. "Now we build the counterattack. Fraud charges, conspiracy to commit theft, legal malpractice, breach of fiduciary duty. We're going after everyone involved." Elizabeth looked at Maya. "And you're going to be a key witness in all of it. Are you prepared for that?" Maya thought about her lost job, her uncertain future, the powerful enemies she'd just made. She thought about her mother, about the empty apartment and the predatory contracts that had destroyed everything. She thought about how many other people were sitting in rooms right now being lied to by people in expensive suits, being told to sign papers they didn't understand, being robbed legally because they didn't know how to read the language of power. "I'm prepared," she said firmly. "Let's make sure they understand that invisible doesn't mean powerless." As they walked out of the courthouse into the gray morning, Maya felt something shift inside her. She'd lost her job, but she'd found her purpose. She'd risked her stability, but she'd gained her voice. The path ahead was uncertain and probably dangerous, but at least it was a path she'd chosen by speaking truth instead of accepting silence. And somewhere in that cold courthouse hallway, she'd stop being the woman no one heard and become the woman who made them listen. The courtroom was packed 3 weeks later when the fraud case officially went to trial. Media outlets had picked up the story with hungry fascination. Billionaire discovers bankruptcy was actually theft. Waitress exposes multi-million-dollar legal conspiracy. The headlines wrote themselves, each one more sensational than the last. Maya sat in the witness waiting area, her hands folded in her lap, trying to ignore the cameras outside and the reporters who tried to corner her on the courthouse steps. Elizabeth had prepared her for this, the public attention, the scrutiny, the way her life would become temporarily public property. But knowing it was coming didn't make it easier when it arrived. The door opened, and Elizabeth stepped in, carrying her now familiar battered briefcase. "They're ready for you. Remember what we practiced. Answer the questions directly, don't volunteer extra information, and if you don't know something, say so. Don't guess." Maya nodded, her throat tight. She testified at the competency hearing, but this was different. This was the real trial, with criminal charges on the table, careers and reputations at stake, and Thomas Thornton himself sitting in the defendant's section with 3 high-priced defense attorneys surrounding him like armor. The courtroom was larger than the one they'd been in before. Judge Morrison presided again, her expression stern as Maya took the stand and was sworn in. She could see Richard sitting behind Elizabeth at the plaintiff's table, his posture straight and alert. He'd regained some weight over the past 3 weeks, looked less like a man drowning and more like someone remembering how to fight. The prosecuting attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana Foster, approached with a gentle smile. "Ms. Jefferson, thank you for being here today. Can you tell the court how you came to be involved in this case?" Maya took a breath and began. She described the private dining room, the legal meeting, the documents she'd noticed while serving. She explained her educational background again, the contract law courses, the accounting certification. She detailed the inconsistencies she'd spotted and the reaction from the lawyers when she'd pointed them out. "When you observed these inconsistencies," Diana asked, "what did you believe was happening?" "I believe Mr. Calloway was being rushed into signing documents that didn't accurately represent his financial situation," Maya said carefully. "The lawyers were pressuring him to sign without allowing time for proper review, and they became hostile when he asked legitimate questions." "Objection!" One of Thornton's lawyers stood up, a man with silver hair and a voice like gravel. "The witness is characterizing normal legal advice as hostile behavior." "Sustained," Judge Morrison said. "Ms. Jefferson, please stick to what you observed rather than your interpretation of motives." Maya nodded. The lawyers raised their voices. They threatened to leave Mr. Calloway, without representation. One of them suggested he was being stupid for asking questions about the documents. When Mr. Calloway requested more time, they said he didn't have time and needed to sign immediately. Diana pulled up a document on the courtroom screen. "Is this the asset reclassification page you noticed?" Maya studied it. "Yes, that's the page that listed Calloway International Holdings as liquidated with zero value." "And what did you know about Calloway International Holdings at that time?" "I knew it was an active company. I'd served lunch to their representatives the week before. They were celebrating a contract renewal worth approximately $13 million over 3 years. So an active, profitable subsidiary was listed as having no value in these bankruptcy documents." "Yes." Diana let that sit for a moment before continuing. "What happened after you brought this to Mr. Calloway's attention?" Maya described the confrontation, the lawyer's increasing anger, Marcus Webb's threat to have her removed, and finally Richard's decision to refuse to sign and dismiss his legal team. She kept her voice steady, her answers factual, but she could feel the weight of every word, the way this testimony was building a picture of calculated deception. The cross-examination came from Thornton's lead attorney, a man named Gregory Sutton, who had a reputation for destroying witnesses on the stand. He approached Maya with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Jefferson, you mentioned serving lunch to representatives from Calloway International Holdings. Did you take notes on this lunch meeting?" "No, sir." "So you're relying entirely on your memory of a casual conversation you overheard while working?" "I remember it because they were celebrating. Happy customers tend to be memorable. But you didn't document it, didn't verify it, didn't confirm any of the details you claim to have heard?" "I had no reason to document lunch conversation at the time. I was serving food, not conducting an investigation." Sutton smiled wider. "Exactly. You were serving food. That's your job, correct? Bringing water, removing plates, staying in the background." "That was my job, yes. Not analyzing complex legal documents. Not providing financial advice. Not inserting yourself into private legal proceedings between a billionaire and his counsel." Maya felt her spine straighten. "I didn't insert myself. I noticed a discrepancy and brought it to Mr. Calloway's attention because it seemed important." "You thought you knew better than 4 experienced attorneys?" "I thought the numbers didn't match reality." "I was right about that." Sutton's smile finally faltered. He shuffled his papers, regrouping. "Ms. Jefferson, isn't it true that you've benefited significantly from this case? That Mr. Calloway has offered to pay for your education?" "Objection." Diana stood up. "Relevance goes to bias, Your Honor. The witness has financial motivation to support the plaintiff's version of events." Judge Morrison considered. "I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Mr. Sutton." "Ms. Jefferson," Sutton pressed, "has Mr. Calloway offered you financial compensation?" "He offered to fund my education as payment for consulting services I provided," Maya said clearly. "I haven't accepted yet. I'm still deciding." That surprised Sutton. Maya could see it in the slight pause before his next question. "Why haven't you accepted?" "Because I want to make sure I'm doing this for the right reasons. Not for money, but because what happened was wrong and needs to be addressed." Sutton had no good follow-up to that. He dismissed her after a few more questions that went nowhere. Maya stepped down, feeling exhausted, but intact. She'd survived cross-examination without breaking, without contradicting herself, without giving them ammunition to use against Richard. The trial continued for 5 more days. Financial experts testified about the asset valuations, explaining how the bankruptcy documents had systematically undervalued Richard's holdings. A forensic accountant walked the jury through the money trail, showing how North Point Capital had purchased Richard's debt cheap, then positioned themselves to acquire his assets through the Meridian Trust structure. David Preston, Richard's former attorney, testified with obvious reluctance. Yes, he'd referred Richard to Webb and Associates. Yes, Marcus Webb had contacted him first, suggesting the referral. Yes, he'd received a finder's fee for the referral, though he claimed not to know it was connected to Thornton's scheme. Richard's former business partners took the stand one by one. Stephen Marsh admitted he'd been approached by Thornton with an offer to buy out his stake in Calloway Enterprises at above market rates if he withdrew immediately. Jennifer Park had received similar offers. Robert Klein broke down on the stand, crying as he admitted he'd known something was wrong, but had been too afraid of losing his own investment to ask questions. But the most damaging testimony came from James Hartford, the quiet lawyer with wire-rimmed glasses who'd barely spoken during that first meeting. Offered immunity in exchange for cooperation, he turned on his colleagues and provided devastating details. Marcus told us the plan 6 months before we approached Mr. Calloway, James said, his voice barely audible. Thornton wanted revenge for being forced out years earlier. He'd been buying up Calloway's debt quietly, waiting for the right moment to strike. When market conditions created some financial pressure on Calloway Enterprises, Thornton saw his opportunity. Marcus coordinated everything. The partner withdrawals, the sudden lawsuits, the credit freezes. It was all designed to push Mr. Calloway into a corner where bankruptcy seemed like his only option. And the bankruptcy documents? Diana asked. They were structured to look like protection, but actually facilitate a hostile takeover. Mr. Calloway would have signed away controlling interest in his company to a trust that Thornton controlled. The company would be acquired at bankruptcy prices, probably 20 cents on the dollar, and Thornton would own everything Richard Calloway had built. Why did you participate in this? James's voice cracked. Because Marcus said it was legal, aggressive but legal. Corporate warfare, not fraud. By the time I understood what we were really doing, I was too deep in to back out without destroying my own career. The defense tried to rehabilitate him, suggesting he was lying to save himself from prosecution. But the documentation backed up his story. Emails between Marcus and Thornton discussing strategy. Wire transfers showing payments to Richard's former partners. Communication logs proving coordination between the lawsuits that had frozen Richard's accounts. Marcus Webb himself took the stand in his own defense, maintaining that everything he'd done was standard bankruptcy practice. He was professional, controlled, completely unshaken by Diana's aggressive questioning. But when she pulled up the email where he'd written to Thornton, "The fish is almost in the net. Just need to maintain pressure until he signs," Marcus's composure finally cracked. "That was metaphorical," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Metaphor for what, Mr. Webb? What fish? What net?" "It's just an expression describing the deliberate manipulation of a vulnerable client for financial gain. I was protecting my client's interests by coordinating with the man who wanted to destroy him, by structuring bankruptcy documents that would transfer his assets to his enemy. That's protection." Marcus had no good answer. He stepped down looking older, his professional armor finally pierced. Thomas Thornton didn't testify. His lawyers advised against it, knowing Diana would tear him apart on cross-examination. But his presence in the courtroom every day told its own story. This wasn't some distant corporate maneuver to him. This was personal, revenge planned carefully over years, executed with precision, and foiled at the last moment by a waitress with good eyes and the courage to speak up. The closing arguments lasted a full day. Thornton's team argued that aggressive business tactics weren't criminal, that debt purchases and bankruptcy filings were legal tools, that their clients had broken no laws, even if their actions seemed morally questionable. Diana's closing was simpler and more powerful. She walked the jury through the timeline, the coordination, the deliberate deception. She reminded them of Maya's testimony, of James Hartford's confession, of the documentation proving conspiracy. And she ended with a question that hung in the courtroom silence. If this isn't fraud, what is? If deliberately manipulating someone into signing away their life's work through false legal documents isn't criminal, then what protection do any of us have against people with money and malice? The law is supposed to protect the vulnerable from the powerful. That's why we're here. That's what justice demands. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Guilty on conspiracy to commit fraud. Guilty on criminal misrepresentation. Guilty on breach of fiduciary duty. Marcus Webb's law license was immediately suspended pending disbarment proceedings. Thomas Thornton faced criminal charges and civil liability that would consume most of his fortune. The other lawyers involved received various penalties, their careers effectively over. Richard sat very still as the verdicts were read, his face carefully neutral. But Maya, sitting in the gallery, saw his hands shake slightly as the judge announced the penalties. This was vindication, but it was also validation of how close he'd come to losing everything to people he'd trusted. 6 months later, Manhattan looked different to Maya. Or maybe she looked at it differently. The same buildings, the same streets, but now she walked through them with her head up instead of eyes down, with confidence earned rather than forced. She sat in a coffee shop near Brooklyn Community College, her laptop open in front of her, working through case studies for her advanced contract law seminar. The scholarship Richard had set up paid for her tuition, books, and enough living expenses that she could focus on school instead of juggling multiple jobs. She'd accepted it eventually, after Elizabeth had convinced her that expert consultants deserved fair compensation for their work. Her phone buzzed with a text from her study group. They wanted to meet Thursday to review for finals. Maya smiled, typing back her confirmation. She had friends now, people who knew her as a serious student rather than just as that waitress from the news. The media attention had faded after a few weeks, the way media attention always did when the next scandal arrived to replace the old one. There had been profile pieces in the Times and Wall Street Journal, interviews on cable news, even a podcast episode about corporate fraud that featured her story. Maya had done a few interviews, enough to tell her side, then quietly withdrawn from the spotlight. She didn't need to be famous. She just needed to finish her degree. The door chimed and Richard Calloway entered, scanning the coffee shop until he spotted her. He looked healthier than he had in months, his face fuller, his eyes clearer. The haunted expression that had characterized their first meetings was gone, replaced by something calmer. Not happiness exactly, but peace. Or at least the beginning of it. "Sorry I'm late," Richard said, sliding into the chair across from her. Traffic for Midtown was terrible. "No problem. How's the restructuring going?" Richard had spent the last 6 months rebuilding his company from the ground up. The forensic accounting had revealed that his financial crisis had been largely manufactured. Most of his assets were intact once the false debt claims were removed and the predatory lawsuits dismissed. He'd emerged from the whole ordeal battered but solvent, with a chance to start over. Slowly, Richard admitted. Turns out rebuilding trust takes longer than losing it. But we're getting there. The European division just signed a new contract that's actually bigger than the one you overheard them celebrating that day. Maya smiled. The $13 million one that didn't exist according to Marcus's documents? That's the one. Turns out accurately representing your assets makes it easier to do business. Who knew? Richard's tone was dry but warm. I wanted to update you on something. We're implementing a new corporate policy. Every major contract, every significant legal filing has to be reviewed by an independent compliance team that includes people from different backgrounds and education levels. No more echo chambers where everyone thinks the same way. That's good, Maya said. Different perspectives catch things that groupthink misses. Exactly. I learned that lesson the expensive way. Richard paused, his expression turning serious. I also wanted to tell you something I should have said months ago. Thank you. Not just for catching the fraud, but for having the courage to speak when silence would have been safer. You saved my life, Maya. I don't say that as exaggeration. You literally saved my life. Maya felt uncomfortable with the gratitude, the way she always did when Richard tried to thank her. You listened. That's the part people forget. I could have spoken up all day, but if you hadn't actually heard me, nothing would have changed. Fair point. Maybe we saved each other. Richard smiled slightly. So what's next for you? Still planning to finish your degree? 1 more year, then I'm applying to law schools. Elizabeth wrote me a recommendation letter that's apparently terrifying in how complimentary it is. Maya grinned. She said any school that doesn't accept me is making a serious mistake. She's not wrong. What kind of law do you want to practice? Consumer protection. Maybe financial fraud investigation. I want to help people who are in the position my mother was in, facing paperwork they don't understand, being taken advantage of by people who know more and use that knowledge as a weapon. Richard nodded slowly. That's good work. Important work. He pulled an envelope from his jacket and set on the table between them. This is also why I wanted to meet today. I have a proposal. Maya looked at the envelope warily. If this is more money, it's not. It's a job offer. Not now, but after you graduate. Callaway Enterprises is creating a new division focused on corporate accountability and ethical business practices. We need someone to run it. Someone who understands how systems can be abused, who isn't afraid to challenge authority, and who has the intelligence to spot problems before they become catastrophes. You want me to work for you? I want you to work with me, Richard corrected. As a partner, not an employee. You'd have full autonomy, direct board access, and the authority to investigate anything that concerns you. Think of it as building the kind of corporate oversight that should have existed before, the kind that might have prevented what happened to your mother. Maya stared at the envelope, not opening it. I haven't even finished my undergraduate degree yet, which is why this is an offer for after you graduate, after law school if you choose to go. 3 years minimum before you'd start. But I wanted you to know the option exists. You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. Maya picked up the envelope but didn't open it. I'll think about it. But Richard, I need you to understand something. If I take this job, I won't be grateful. I'll do the work because it's the right work to do, not because I owe you something. Good, Richard said simply. Gratitude makes terrible motivation for the kind of work I'm describing. Conviction, on the other hand, makes excellent motivation. And you got plenty of that. They talked for another hour about less serious things. Richard's daughter had been accepted to Cornell. His wife had moved back into the Manhattan apartment now that the media circus had calmed down. He was learning to delegate more, trust more carefully, and actually listen to people he'd once dismissed as background noise. Maya told him about her classes, her study group, the apartment she'd moved into in a better neighborhood now that she didn't have to work 40 hours a week while attending school. Small things, normal things, the kind of mundane progress that mattered more than headlines. When they parted ways outside the coffee shop, Maya felt something shift inside her. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The trial was over, justice had been served, but the real work was just starting. The work of building systems that protected people instead of exploiting them. The work of creating structures where truth could be spoken without risking everything. The work of making sure that the next person in her mother's position had someone who could read the documents, spot the lies, and fight back. Maya walked through Manhattan with the envelope in her bag and her laptop over her shoulder. Just another student in a city full of students. But she knew something most of them didn't yet understand. Power wasn't permanent. Intelligence wasn't reserved for people with expensive degrees. And sometimes the most important voice in the room was the one nobody expected to hear. 3 years later, Maya Jefferson graduated from Brooklyn Community College with honors. She was accepted to Columbia Law School with a full scholarship. And on her desk throughout law school, she kept a small note written on a napkin. Page 14, Section C, Asset Active. 5 words that had changed 2 lives and brought down a conspiracy. 5 words that proved you didn't need to be powerful to make a difference. You just needed to pay attention, have courage, and refuse to let the powerful convince you that your eyes were lying. Richard Callaway attended her law school graduation, sitting in the audience beside Elizabeth Reeves. When Maya walked across the stage to receive her diploma, she saw them both applauding, 2 people who believed her when belief required risk. She thought about her mother, who hadn't lived to see this moment, but whose lessons had made it possible. After graduation, Maya spent 3 years at a nonprofit legal clinic specializing in consumer fraud cases. She won more cases than she lost, developed a reputation for thorough document analysis and fearless cross-examination, and learned how to fight for people who couldn't afford to fight for themselves. And then, when the time was right, she opened the envelope Richard had given her that day in the coffee shop. The offer was still there, still waiting. Director of Corporate Accountability and Ethics at Callaway Enterprises. Full autonomy. Board access. The power to investigate and expose wrongdoing from inside a major corporation. Maya accepted the position on one condition. She could continue taking pro bono cases on the side, helping people who faced the same kind of predatory contracts that had destroyed her mother. Richard agreed immediately. On her first day, Maya walked into Callaway Enterprises headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. The building was glass and steel, expensive and imposing, the kind of place where power concentrated and decisions affected thousands of lives. She took the elevator to the executive floor, carrying the same worn notebook she'd used when she was studying contract law while serving coffee to people who didn't see her. Richard met her at the elevator, his smile genuine and warm. "Welcome to the team. Your office is ready. So is the corporate board. They're nervous about having an ethics watchdog with real teeth, which means we probably got the power balance right." Maya smiled back, that same steady confidence she'd felt when she'd written 5 words on a napkin and changed everything. Good. Nervous boards make fewer mistakes. They walked down the hallway together, past offices full of people